My name is Cindi Jones. I'm a faculty member in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk about our process as we begin our truly what is just our second year of NatureRx programming. My motivation, well, I should back up and say that my research focuses on plant adaptations to the environment. And I also put this picture in to remind myself to tell you that I'm also the director of our Plant Biodiversity Conservatory, and you'll see in a minute why that's relevant. But my motivation for starting NatureRx at UConn is twofold. One is that, I care a lot about the natural world. I've been studying it my entire career. But the other is that I also care deeply about my students. And so I was first introduced to NatureRx, or the idea of NatureRx, in 2019. And I guess we'll have the next slide. I guess before I get to that part, I just wanted to say that I stumbled across this description of the vision, or the vision statement for Parks RX recently, and realized that there's this one line: spending time in and around nature is the single most important first step to improving both human and planetary health. Sort of really encapsulates my motivation, as I'm sure it does for many of us at this symposium. Next slide. So I started NatureRx after reading Don Rakow's book, and I decided to approach it basically using his guide, which I thought, or their guide, Don Rakow and Gregory L's books, which was really helpful. And so I set about contacting people that I thought would be interested, and contacted administrators, things like that. And we had our first meeting in February of 2020. And shortly thereafter, it became very clear we weren't going to be meeting in person anymore. So we decided instead, a graduate student in my lab works on, he had done taken some GIS courses, and he wanted to work on his mapping skills. So next slide. He and I decided that we would spend the pandemic, to the extent that we could, building a website. So we also worked with another graduate student in our department who was a website developer, and the website is here. What Henry did was to contact all of the local regions in the town of Mansfield. I wanted to focus on the town of Mansfield because it's where UConn is. And it's also a fairly heavily wooded area. UConn's a fairly rural campus. And so we contacted the local organizations that maintain trails. The town maintains trails. There are trails through Connecticut forest or UConn forest property, and there are trails that are owned and maintained by a local nature conservancy organization. And Henry acquired their map layers and then put them all together into this single package, which we then brought up to the website. And you can see that we've organized these both in terms of where people might want to go, through locations, and then also in terms of activities. One of the things we discovered, this was the first time anybody had brought all these map layers together, and we have over 121 miles of trails just in the town of Mansfield alone. So a lot of potential hiking places for people if they just knew how to get there. But the other thing we acknowledged is that people, especially students that are on campus for the first time and in a rural environment for the first time, may not feel comfortable hiking. And so we also inventoried all of the quiet spaces on campus that were places with benches under trees and places with a view. And so if you actually want to look for those, you can go to those too. Next slide. We officially launched the website at a symposium that we timed to coincide with the symposium last year, Everyone's Earth. That was also right about that time in the fall. And the mini symposium that we ran was structured so that it invited researchers from across campus who, in one way or another, work on the relationship or the interaction between humans and health. And so we had speakers from a range of departments, including natural resources and the environment and family studies, all brought together. And then after the symposium, we formed what I thought of as more official steering committee and spent a couple of meetings just talking about possible activities, things that we could do to launch NatureRx. And it very quickly became clear, next slide, to us that there was far more that we could do in terms of possibility than we could probably actually realistically do. And it became clear also that we would need a mission statement, as in we would need to figure out what our own skills and strengths and interests were, and then tailor whatever program we launched accordingly. And so this is the latest statement of our mission statement. And rather than focusing on writing prescriptions, because our mental health facilities were completely overwhelmed at this point and had other priorities, which I totally understand, we decided that we would focus on promoting the benefits of spending time in nature and then developing activities for the Yukon community, but especially for students, and then also trying to foster collaborations among researchers. Next slide. One of the first things we did was to then have a student focus group. And this was really interesting for me. I'd never done this kind of a thing. We had a facilitator from Student Health and Wellness who was doing an internship on NatureRx, and she's the one who facilitated it. And one of the first questions we ask is, given the pandemic and all of the media attention to the fact that nature was good for you, how much do you feel like you guys really understand? And the answer was pretty much across the board. Yeah, we know that being in nature is good for us, but we can't always make ourselves do it, right? Or that they forget to do the things that are good for them. And the other thing that came out of this is that because being a student comes first, and then maybe they would take care of mental health. And so they felt like we really needed things that would emphasize the positive effects of being in nature, as, for example, students walked across campus. And so we talked about possibly identifying these short sort of 10-minute mindfulness walks, things like that. The students also emphasized that the activities needed to be intentional and interactive. And I completely agree with that. But when I brought this back to the steering committee, the question was, intentional towards what? Is this intentional towards moving your own mental health? Or do we just sort of focus on getting people outside? I mean, what really are our goals here? And a group I was talking to recently said, well, if you want to advertise NatureRx activities, maybe you could make it in terms, or package it in terms of investing in self. This is a self-investment, right? Being in nature is really good for you, and you will benefit from it. So sort of self-care more than mental health specifically. And then the other thing, which has already been mentioned, is that they suggested that rather than sort of taking on a lot of initiatives that were only NatureRx, that we would partner with existing clubs. And I think that's what we're going to do, as well as they suggested that we emphasize freshmen, because they said by the time students are juniors, they're way too busy. And I think that's a really, really good idea. So with this in mind, and with cold weather in mind, one of the things that we did last spring, was to jointly sponsor with the Plant Biodiversity Conservatory what we called a houseplant workshop. This was just a one-day event, and we had them held it at the greenhouses. And it wasn't just a plant giveaway, which is always also popular, but instead, next slide, please. We combined sort of, well, we had propagated a bunch of plants in the greenhouse, and then what we did was had the staff present basic information on how to care for houseplants, sort of talking about some of the nuances that maybe a first-time houseplant owner might not consider, like why you would choose one type of soil or media over another, how to tell if you're overwatering your plants, why succulents are different, for example, from tropical plants. And then next slide. After a bit of instruction, we had provided students with the plants that we had propagated. As we said, they got to choose their plants, they got to choose their pots, and decorate their pots if they wanted to, and plant them up and carry them out. And this was really, you know, most of the supplies were donated by the greenhouses, and it was a pretty popular event. But I learned a couple of important things from this event. One of them was that I had originally hoped to use this event to advertise NatureRx across campus, and the fact that NatureRx was holding events or co-sponsoring events. And so we knew we had only a limited number of slots. We set up the situation so we had 12 students come in, but we had 12 students, 3 different time periods. So we had a room for a total of 36 students, and we had them sign up through the website. And all of that was, I thought, really a great idea, and I was hoping it would fill, et cetera, et cetera. And then we announced it on the EEB Greenhouses Instagram account, and all the slots were gone in 50 minutes. So, you know, so much for rolling it out to the broader community, right? That just didn't work very well. The second thing I learned from this is that on the day of event, over a third of the students didn't show up, even though they had signed up. And so if you do NatureRx related events with limited slot time or limited space, overbook. That was the next thing that we learned, and that's what we'll do in the future. One of the other things that I did, can we go back one slide? Oops, not all, there. Is that you can see that we had designed a logo by a fellow faculty member who just enjoys designing logos that you can see here on the left. And we had the QR code linked to our website, and I talked in the event about the NatureRx and what it meant. But later in the semester, I also took this same sign to a tabling event in honor of Earth Day, and with no other information other than the sign, hoping that that would attract students to come ask us what it was. And I just wanted to tell you that I think for those of you who are designing logos, we're going to consider adding more explanation to ours, because most of the students who came up assumed that we were talking about medicinal plants or using medicinal plants to feel better, or that we were actually talking about cannabis. So again, a lesson learned in that regard. We may change our logo a little bit. And then 2 slides forward. Okay, time's up. I just wanted to say we're also partnering on a project or an initiative called Mindfulness for Earth through our Global Affairs office. And I can talk more about that if anyone's interested. Thank you. Next slide is my acknowledgements or supporters on campus.
Great. Thank you so much, Cindi. Wonderful.